On May 12, 1797, the greatest city-state in European history died without a fight. Napoleon Bonaparte's army stood at the gates of Venice, and inside the palace of the Doge, the ruler of the Venetian Republic, the aristocrats gathered to make a decision that would have been unthinkable just a century before. They voted to surrender. No siege, no battle, no heroic last stand. The republic that had lasted over 1,000 years, that had built an empire stretching from the Alps to the eastern Mediterranean, that had once been the richest city on earth, simply gave up. The French soldiers marched into St. Mark's Square unopposed. They tore down the golden lion of St. Mark, the symbol of Venetian power, and loaded it onto a ship bound for Paris. They looted the treasuries. They melted down the golden artifacts. They dismantled the arsenal, the massive shipyard that had once built a warship every single day. Napoleon looked at the ruins of Venetian greatness and said, "I will be an Attila to the Venetian state." And he was. But the truth is that Venice had already been dead for decades. The city that surrendered in 1797 was a ghost, a museum, a playground for aristocrats who lived off the fading memory of wealth their ancestors had accumulated centuries before. The real death of Venice had not happened in 1797. It had happened in 1498, when a Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama sailed around the southern tip of Africa and opened a sea route to India. In that single moment, the geographical monopoly that had made Venice the center of the world was broken, and everything that followed was just the slow-motion collapse of an empire that had been built on a single, fragile advantage: control of the spice trade. This is the story of how Venice rose from a cluster of muddy islands to become the New York of the medieval world. And it is the story of how that same city, drunk on its own wealth and blinded by its own arrogance, failed to adapt when the world changed. It is a warning about the danger of monopolies, the fragility of trade empires, and the iron law of economics. When your business model depends on controlling a choke point, and someone finds a way around it, you die. To understand the rise of Venice, you have to go back to the collapse of Rome. In the 5th century, as barbarian armies swept across Italy, refugees fled to the only place the invaders could not reach, the marshes. The Venetian lagoon was a hellish place. It was a maze of shallow waters, shifting sandbars, and mosquito-infested islands. No roads, no fresh water, no farmland. It was the last place anyone would want to build a city. But that isolation was exactly what made it safe. The refugees drove wooden pilings deep into the mud and built their houses on top. They dug wells to collect rainwater. They fished. They harvested salt from the sea. They survived, and slowly, over centuries, they began to thrive. Because while they had no land, they had something more valuable: access to the sea. Venice became a city of traders. They had no choice. They could not grow food, so they had to trade for it. They became middlemen, buying goods from the Byzantine Empire in the east and selling them to the barbarian kingdoms in the west. They built boats, they learned to navigate the treacherous lagoon, they learned to sail the Adriatic, and they learned the most important skill of all. They learned how to make money from other people's labor. By the 9th century, Venice had become rich, not from making things, but from moving things. They were the FedEx of the medieval world. They charged fees to transport goods. They charged fees to store goods. They charged fees to insure goods, and because they controlled the ships and the knowledge of the sea routes, they could set the prices. It was a brilliant business model. But the real turning point came in the year 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to be a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. The Pope called for it. The kings of Europe pledged their support. An army of knights assembled in Venice, ready to sail to the Holy Land. But there was a problem. The Crusaders had no money. They had promised to pay Venice to transport them across the Mediterranean. But when the time came to pay, they were broke. The Venetians, led by their Doge, Enrico Dandolo, faced a dilemma. They had built a fleet of ships specifically for this crusade. They had invested enormous resources. If the Crusaders could not pay, Venice would be ruined. Dandolo was 90 years old and blind, but he was not senile. He was one of the most ruthless businessmen in history. He made the Crusaders an offer. Venice would transport them for free, but in exchange they had to do Venice a favor. They had to conquer the Christian city of Zara, a rival port on the Adriatic coast that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders, desperate and broke, agreed. They attacked Zara. They sacked it. The Pope was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade. But Dandolo was not finished. He convinced the Crusaders to go one step further. He convinced them to attack Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest city in Christendom. Why? Because Constantinople owed Venice money, and because Dandolo wanted revenge. Decades earlier, he had been the Venetian ambassador to Constantinople. The Byzantines had arrested him, tortured him, and allegedly blinded him. Now he had an army at his disposal, and he was going to use it. In 1204, the Crusaders stormed Constantinople. They looted it for 3 days. They stole everything: gold, silver, jewels, religious relics, art. The entire accumulated wealth of 1,000 years of empire was carted off and loaded onto Venetian ships. The 4 bronze horses that now stand above St. Mark's Basilica in Venice were ripped from the hippodrome of Constantinople. The treasures of the Byzantine emperors filled the vaults of Venice. It was the greatest heist in history, and it made Venice unimaginably rich. With the wealth of Constantinople, Venice exploded. The city became the financial capital of Europe. Venetian merchants opened trading posts across the Mediterranean. They established colonies in Crete, Cyprus, and the Greek islands. They controlled the ports, they controlled the shipping lanes, and most importantly, they controlled the trade in spices. Spices were the oil of the medieval world: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were not luxuries, they were necessities. In an age before refrigeration, spices were used to preserve meat. They were used to mask the taste of rotten food. They were used in medicine. They were worth more than gold by weight. And they only grew in one place: the East India, Indonesia, and the Spice Islands. To get spices to Europe, they had to travel thousands of miles, overland, through Central Asia, or by sea through the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, and then overland again to the Mediterranean ports. The journey was dangerous. It took months, and every step of the way, middlemen took a cut. By the time a pound of pepper reached Europe, it had passed through a dozen hands, and its price had multiplied 100-fold. But there was one final gateway that every spice shipment had to pass through: Venice. The Venetians had made exclusive deals with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt and the spice merchants of Alexandria. All spices entering Europe from the east had to be sold to Venetian traders first. It was a monopoly, and it made Venice obscenely wealthy. The wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small number of merchant families: the Contarini, the Moculmito, the Corner. These families built palaces along the Grand Canal. They commissioned art from the greatest painters: Titian, Tintoretto, Bellini. They lived like kings. By the 15th century, Venice was the richest city in Europe. It was said that the wealth of Venice was equal to the wealth of all of France. The city had a population of 200,000, which made it one of the largest cities in the world. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis where Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Turks, and Germans lived and traded. It was a republic, but not a democracy. It was an oligarchy. Power was held by a small group of aristocratic families who elected the Doge. The system was designed to prevent any one man from gaining too much power, but it also made the government slow, cautious, and obsessed with maintaining the status quo. And that would be its downfall. In 1453, the world changed. Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. The city that had been the heart of Christendom for 1,000 years was now in Muslim hands. The Ottomans renamed it Istanbul and made it the capital of their empire. For Venice, this was a disaster. The Ottomans controlled the overland routes to Asia. They controlled the Black Sea. They controlled the Bosporus, and they were not friendly to Christian merchants. The Venetians tried to negotiate. They paid bribes. They signed treaties. They maintained a diplomatic relationship with the Ottomans because they had no choice. If the Ottomans cut them off, the spice trade would die. But the relationship was fragile. The Ottomans saw Venice as a rival, and they were right. For decades, Venice and the Ottomans fought a series of wars over control of the eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians won some battles. They lost more. Slowly, steadily, the Ottomans chipped away at the Venetian Empire. They took Greek islands. They took ports. They strangled Venetian trade routes. By the late 15th century, Venice was on the defensive. The spice monopoly was slipping. The costs of defending the empire were rising. And then, in 1498, the final blow fell. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and reached India. He returned to Lisbon with a cargo hold full of spices. and he had bypassed Venice entirely. The age of exploration had begun, and Venice had been left behind. The Portuguese discovery of the sea route to India was an extinction-level event for Venice. For centuries, Venice had prospered because geography gave them a monopoly. Spices had to pass through the Middle East, and Venice controlled the gateway. But now, the Portuguese had found a way around the gateway. They could sail directly to India, load their ships with spices, and sail back to Europe without ever touching a Venetian port. The economics were brutal. A Venetian merchant might buy a pound of pepper in Alexandria for 10 ducats and sell it in Venice for 30, but a Portuguese merchant could buy the same pepper in India for 1 ducat and sell it in Lisbon for 20. Even after accounting for the cost and risk of the voyage, the Portuguese were making a fortune, and they were undercutting Venice. Within a decade, the price of spices in Europe collapsed. The Venetian monopoly was broken. The merchants who had grown fat on the spice trade watched their profits evaporate. The Venetian government panicked. They sent diplomats to Lisbon to negotiate. They sent spies to sabotage Portuguese ships. They even considered digging a canal through Egypt to create a shortcut to the Indian Ocean, but the project was too expensive and too ambitious. Nothing worked. The Portuguese had the advantage, and they were not going to give it up. By the 1520s, Lisbon had replaced Venice as the spice capital of Europe. The wealth that had flowed into Venice for 3 centuries now flowed into Lisbon. And the Venetians, who had built an entire economy on being the middlemen, suddenly found themselves irrelevant. But the collapse of the spice trade was not the only problem. Venice's banking system, which had once been the most sophisticated in Europe, was also crumbling. Venetian banks had financed trade across the Mediterranean. They had issued letters of credit, managed deposits, and provided loans to merchants and governments. But in the 16th century, a series of financial crises shook the system. Several major banks collapsed. The Pisani Bank failed in 1584, taking down the fortunes of one of Venice's oldest families. The Priuli Bank failed. The Tiepolo Bank failed. Each collapse wiped out the savings of hundreds of investors. The problem was that the Venetian banks had been lending money to fund risky ventures. They had financed trading expeditions that never returned. They had lent money to governments that defaulted. And as the spice trade dried up, the returns on investment disappeared. The banks could not cover their liabilities. They collapsed, and with them they took the credibility of Venice as a financial center. By the 17th century, the financial capital of Europe had moved north, to Amsterdam, to London. Venice was no longer the place where deals were made. It was a backwater, a relic of a bygone age. The palaces were still there, the art was still there, but the money was gone. The Venetian elite watched their empire crumble, but they refused to adapt. They were trapped by their own success. For centuries, the Venetian system had worked. The aristocracy had grown rich by controlling trade. They had no incentive to change, so they clung to the old ways. They passed laws to protect their monopolies. They restricted who could trade. They tried to exclude foreigners. But these protectionist measures only accelerated the decline. Merchants and traders who were excluded from Venice simply took their business elsewhere, to Amsterdam, where the Dutch were building a new global trading empire, to London, where the English were creating the joint stock company and modern capitalism. Venice, once the most innovative economy in Europe, became conservative, rigid, and inward-looking. The government became paralyzed by infighting between the old merchant families. Decisions that should have taken days took years. By the 18th century, Venice was a tourist destination. The aristocracy, no longer able to make money from trade, turned the city into a playground. The Carnival of Venice became world-famous: masked balls, gambling houses, courtesans. The city became synonymous with decadence. Wealthy Europeans came to Venice to indulge in pleasures they could not enjoy at home. The Venetians, who had once been the hard-nosed merchants and warriors of the Mediterranean, had become entertainers and innkeepers. It was a humiliating transformation, but it was profitable, at least for a while. The aristocracy lived off the tourists and the rents from properties they owned, but they were no longer creating wealth. They were consuming it. And when Napoleon's army arrived in 1797, they had nothing left to defend. The fall of Venice is one of history's great economic tragedies. It is the story of a city that rose to unimaginable heights through innovation, risk-taking, and ruthless pragmatism. And then it is the story of that same city's refusal to adapt when the world changed. The Venetians made the classic mistake of monopolists. They believed that their position was permanent. They believed that because they had always controlled the spice trade, they always would. They could not imagine a world in which their monopoly did not exist. But monopolies are fragile. They depend on barriers to entry, geography, technology, regulation. When those barriers fall, the monopoly dies, and the Venetians had built their entire civilization on a geographical barrier. The fact that there was no sea route to India, when Vasco da Gama found that route, the barrier fell, and Venice fell with it. The lesson is clear. No advantage lasts forever. The world changes. Technology changes. Trade routes change. If you do not adapt, you die. The Venetians had 6 centuries to prepare. They had the wealth, they had the knowledge, they had the ships. They could have funded their own expeditions to find the sea route to India. They could have invested in new industries. They could have diversified their economy. But they did not. They clung to the past, and the past buried them. Today, Venice is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Millions of tourists visit every year to see the palaces, the art, and the canals. But the city is sinking. Literally, the wooden pilings that the refugees drove into the mud 1,500 years ago are rotting. The sea is rising. The population has collapsed from 200,000 at its height to fewer than 50,000 today. The city is a museum, a monument to a lost age. But it is also a warning to every city, every company, and every nation that believes its dominance is permanent. Venice was the richest city on earth. It controlled the global economy. And then it lost everything. Not because it was conquered, but because it was bypassed. The world moved on, and Venice did not. The merchants of Venice believed they were too big to fail. They believed that Europe needed them. They believed that their monopoly on spices made them indispensable. They were wrong. Europe found another way, and Venice became irrelevant. This is the ultimate lesson of economic history. You are only as powerful as your last innovation. You are only as wealthy as your ability to adapt. And when the world changes, you change with it, or you become a ghost. Venice is that ghost, a beautiful, haunting reminder that empires built on monopolies are just waiting for someone to find a way around them. This is Financial Injustice. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.